So there's much to discuss about Venezuela. Joining us here in the studio is Eric Farnsworth. He's the Vice President of the Americas Society and the Council of Americas. Also with us from Paris is Dany Bahar. He's a Venezuelan economist and a fellow at the Global Economy and Development Program at the Brookings Institution. And Mark Weisbrot, he is the co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research here in Washington, D.C. Thanks all for joining us. Let's start with you, Dany. We heard an introduction into Hugo Chavez's legacy there. It seems like elections are going to go forward. What are the major sticking points now as we head into that key date?
Well, on the political side, what's going to happen on May now, it's not really an election, it's a coronation, because we all know that the conditions for a free and fair election are not in place. Maduro signed some document on his own, claiming that that's something the opposition wanted to sign to, but the opposition clearly stated that that's not, the conditions on that piece of paper are not enough, and therefore there's no reason really for the opposition to participate in any election that they know for sure that they're going to lose. And it's not something new. We have precedents of that in all the elections that happened last year. Clearly, there's a lot of evidence to show that they were fake and not real. And all this happening, you know, in the midst of one of the worst, if not the worst, humanitarian crisis that the hemisphere has seen. Poverty rates are higher than the levels that when Chavez started government. People are starving. They have lost, 75% of Venezuelans have lost up to 20 pounds of weight. Infant mortality is at the same level as in Pakistan, the highest in the world. Poverty levels are the same in sub-Saharan Africa, and people are fleeing the country. So this is really a humanitarian crisis that is a result of 20 years of mismanagement, corruption, and the inability and incapacity of this government to really manage a country.
Well, Mark was shaking his head here. You know, let's put that to you. Neighbouring countries have all said that these elections can't be free and fair. What's your take?
That's really, you know, I don't even know where to start with this. I mean,
it's a live show. We've got to go somewhere.
You know, first of all, you have a history, as Dany said. You have 20 years of elections since Chavez was elected. And except for one uncontested election where there weren't opposition observers, there has never been any credible doubts raised about the vote count and the results, okay? And anybody... you cannot find a single expert on elections or with knowledge of Venezuela who will say that there is. So that's just false. And the people want to vote. That's the first thing you have to realize. The latest reliable opposition pollster found 77% of people intended to vote in this election. They want to vote, even though the opposition, his friends, are calling for a boycott. They want to vote because they want an end to this crisis. And only 12% said they wouldn't vote in this election. And they know that the vote count is going to be clean. The government, you know, if it's not, Falcone will withdraw from the race. If he doesn't have the guarantees that they had in 2015, he only went back 1 year. Just take 2015. The opposition won by a landslide, and the vote count was clean. And nobody has any doubt about that. So this is what we're really talking about. The opposition is boycotting because they want to overthrow the government. The Trump administration has stated publicly they want to overthrow the government, and that's why you have a boycott.
Thanks, Mark. A lengthy but very necessary answer. I get you. Eric, try and clear this up for us, because we've basically got a difference of opinion here in terms of what the opposition, whether the vote can be fed. For those who don't follow Venezuela all the time, some of the opposition parties have been banned, but we have other contenders coming to the fore, and it looks like the opposition is fragmenting and the vote will go ahead. Where does that's true, right? And where does the region, including the United States, stand in this?
Well, broadly speaking, I think that's accurate. Some parties have been banned. Some individuals, political leaders in Venezuela, have been jailed. They've been put in jail or house arrest. So the ability for the opposition to organize around some of the natural leaders has been circumscribed by the government. The international community has broadly condemned this. A group called the Lima Group, which is made up of countries from Latin America as well as Canada, have said that this is a vote that's not going to be free and fair. The president of Venezuela has been disinvited from the Summit of the Americas. It's supposed to happen in April because of the lack of democracy and democratic process in the country. So broadly speaking, this process has been rejected in advance by the international community.
Okay, we're waiting for another guest, and he's just joined us. I want to introduce him to us. From Miami, we have Eduardo Gamarra. He's a professor of political science at Florida International University. Thanks so much for joining us, Eduardo. A very heated discussion at the beginning, at the outset. I hope you heard some of it about whether these elections can be legitimate or not. Let me ask you about both internally and externally where you see this process going, and whether the promise of the United Nations coming in and acting as observers will help legitimize this process.
Well, that's a difficult question to answer, and especially given the discussion you just had. I think basically the government in Venezuela is looking for a way to legitimate a process, and it's doing so in a rather predictable fashion. The OAS asked Venezuela to postpone the elections. It did so just a month. And in fact, it's interesting to note that several countries that used to be basically very, very supportive of the Maduro regime, such as Ecuador, for example, have just recently abstained, sort of permitting this postponement of the elections, giving the government of Venezuela perhaps some breathing space to seek international recognition. My impression is, in looking at this very carefully, is that it's going to be impossible to secure international recognition. The elections, however, are likely to go forth. I think the idea that Venezuelans want to vote is probably true, but they probably don't want to vote under the current circumstances. A recent report, for example, suggests that there are about 4 million Venezuelans who have left the country. They have essentially voted through immigration. That would be about 25% of the electorate is out of the country now. And probably that most of those people that voted with their feet are people that would have voted against this government. So I think it's, any analysis of Venezuela today is tainted primarily by ideological positions that have polarized this country since the very beginning.
Eric, you want to respond to that, and then I'll go to Dany.
Mark.
Sorry, Mark. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think it's, first of all, those immigration numbers are grossly exaggerated, but I don't have time to go into
about 1 million, it seems.
Yeah, it's in the million, but it's not 4 million. But anyway.
But it's a large number.
Yeah, it's a large number, of course. I mean, they're having a terrible depression.
In Colombia and...
The economy is a wreck. And, of course, people leave the country for opportunities elsewhere. But the polls are based on the people in the country. And the polls did not ask, did you want to vote in some ideal or other conditions? They asked, did you want to vote in this election, even when it was going to be in April, and they still they
I think
wanted
you're
to
citing
vote.
one poll.
And no,
Okay.
you can look at, and also, the other thing is that Falcón is leading in the polls. Okay, he's leading, and he's ahead of Maduro by 7 or 8 percentage points from multiple polls. So this is something that the Trump administration doesn't want. And the opposition has always been divided. You can go back to 2004 when they had a referendum and Chavez won by a landslide. Most of the opposition said it was fraud. It was ridiculous, but they said it. And then they boycotted the National Assembly elections in 2005 on that basis. So you can't go by this opposition coalition saying they don't want to participate. And it's, the example he gives of Ecuador, I mean, I can answer that too. Ecuador's had a change of government, so this government is trying to be more friendly to the United States. That's what the Lima Group is about. It's right-wing governments who are going along with the United States in their strategy to overthrow this government. That is their solution. They want to make the economy worse. That's what the Trump financial sanctions are doing. They stated openly, Tillerson said openly, that our Secretary of State, he said that a military coup would be a good thing. Marco Rubio said the same thing. He's deciding policy. So that is their strategy, and there's always been a part of the opposition that supported that strategy, and that's the part he's referring to.
Mark, Dany, Mark does have a point. The language from Washington has been unhelpful at times, hasn't it? And this is where this idea comes from. Dany?
Well, this is not about Washington. I just want to say, to be honest, look, I know Mark for a few months. I met him in the set, and I actually look online at the things that he wrote. He wrote this article in November of 2013 in The Guardian, where he says, this happened already 5 years ago, where he says things
you want me
such
to start trolling
hyperinflation
him?
in Venezuela is a remote possibility. Hold on.
Dany,
Hyperinflation is a remote possibility. You say Venezuela has enough to cover at least 8 months of imports. Venezuela has defaulted. Hold on. Then you say, how can a government with more than $90 billion in all revenue end up with a crisis? Explain to me how.
I'll explain it to you. I'll explain it to you.
Mark, can we just keep it simple?
Hold on, Mark. Hold on. I'll let you talk. I just want to
finish.
say to the viewers something that is interesting. I think that Mark's perspective on the country shows that he doesn't really understand what's happening on the ground. Look at this article. It's completely out of reality. And whatever he's saying today, it doesn't really reflect what can happen. So I'm happy to sit with you, Mark, in D.C. and talk about the country. But I don't think you really understand what's happening on the ground. People are dying. People are starving. Yes, a huge flow of refugees are leaving the country, not because they're looking for better opportunities, but because if they stay there, they die either because the crime is too high or because they don't have enough food to eat. The currency has lost more than 90% of the value. Let me finish. And people with a minimum salary cannot consume more than 7,000 calories a day. You tell me, how do you feed a family with that salary? These countries in ruin because of this government, and you simply looking at this, you don't understand it.
Thank you. Mark, instead of responding for the tip, sorry, can I just set some ground?
Articles of mine from 5 years ago.
Can I just set some ground rules?
3 against 1.
Can I just set some ground rules? Sorry,
get a response.
excuse me. Instead of replying about the article and tit for tat, can you address the problem that Dany just came up with, which is that the economic situation in Venezuela is so horrible that people have been dying, that there's a million refugees, that inflation is at 13,000%, over 100 people died in demonstrations last year. Is this the end of Maduro?
Well, it could be. I mean, as I said, the latest polls show that he would lose an election, but these people don't want to take a chance on that. Okay, because they think they've got it made. They think because of the description, the situation that Dany described, they can overthrow this government, which they've been trying to do for 20 years now. And they think that this is it. It's in the bag, because how could they possibly? What they don't understand is that Venezuela is a polarized country. Okay, there's 6 million people that vote for the government in spite of the fact that this is the worst economic contraction in Latin American history, and inflation is over 3,000%. And part of the reason they vote for him is because they're afraid of what would happen if the opposition took power, because the opposition is violent. Part of the opposition is violent. They established a dictatorship for 48 hours when they overthrew the government in 2002. So there could be political persecution, okay? And that's part of the problem too. There has to be a negotiated solution. Dany's right about how bad the situation is, but that's why people want to vote, because most people see elections as part of a solution to the problem rather than a violent triumph of one side against the other.
Eric, does Mark have a point in terms of where the opposition has traditionally been seen both internally and externally in Venezuela, that it has been very much a pro-Washington influence?
No, I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, not everybody in the opposition sees the world the same way, but that's not a moral failing. I mean, if they're not unified, I mean, our own political parties in the U.S. aren't unified, so I don't know why that's a disqualifier. Having said that, the government in power in Caracas is very intentionally doing everything it can to try to divide the opposition. It's jailing some leaders, it's persecuting others, it's favoring some. So, you know, this is a very difficult terrain to be competing on. I would wish that the government would spend more time working on the economy and trying to improve the economy, and less time trying to persecute the opposition and go into an election with one or both hands tied behind their back.
Eduardo, let's hear from the man himself, Nicolas Maduro, who is predicting a big victory going forward. Let's just listen to what he has to say.
Nicolas Maduro Moros.
Nicolas Maduro Moros, presidential candidate, will get a record vote, the highest vote ever received by a presidential candidate in Venezuela's Republican history, because many people from the opposition will vote for Nicolas Maduro because he gives them the guarantee of peace, stability, and a future.
Eduardo, the highest vote ever, even more than Hugo Chavez. He does live in his shadow. What difficulty does Maduro have in Venezuela living up to that legacy?
Well, I think it's interesting that he would say the highest vote. It reminds me of another president who happens to sit in Washington, D.C. And in many ways, I think it's important to understand that these exaggerations often aren't met with with any kind of substance. But I think we're you know, and just listening to this back and forth between my colleagues, it's really interesting. We're kind of stuck between, you know, on the one hand, one of your guests sort of says, you know, we're those of us who are looking at Maduro more critically are, of course, unhesitantly supporting somebody whom, in fact, most Venezuelans I know do not like. And in fact, I conducted the study here in the community. There's a few who are very closely identified with President Trump, but most don't. Most, in fact, kind of think of him as the American Chavez. And so these exaggerations are very common, you see. And the fact of the matter is that we have been very accustomed to these exaggerations, and we see them, you know, it's sort of a pattern of governance that Maduro has accustomed Venezuelans to. And it's interesting, you know, because in many ways there is a core in Venezuela, and Mark Weisbrot is correct. There is a core in Venezuela which absolutely supports President Maduro, come rain or shine, for whatever reason. The same way we have, you know, a very, very solid core of crazies in this country who also support President Trump. So that shouldn't be surprising. And so I think, you know, it's important to place at least some analytical boundaries here and leave the ideology to others.
Mark, obviously you feel a little ganged up on here, so I'm just going to give you this, but can you try and also talk about the American sanctions that have been imposed economically, and what effect they are having? But please respond if you feel you need to.
Yeah, no, I think that's important, and I didn't say what the professor accused me of saying. Okay. Yeah, I didn't say that if you don't like Maduro, you must like Trump, okay? What I said, I'm arguing that there should be an election. It's what people want. Okay, you said that before. And I only am arguing, I'm not guaranteeing unconditionally that the government's going to have an election like they had in 2015, where, you know, everything was in fact clean and the opposition won by a landslide, okay? I'm not saying that, I'm just saying that if those conditions can be met, and Falcone is not a stooge of this government, he's not going to accept it.
Yes, he's a former governor.
If they steal the election from him, he's going to say so, and he's going to have the United States and the whole hemisphere behind him, okay? Now, the Trump sanctions are extremely important because, you know, it's true that the government has some advantages in the election. It's also true that they excluded a couple of the most popular opposition candidates. But it's also true that Trump has an enormous foot on the scale of these elections because he has told the people of Venezuela that if they don't vote, if they have this election and they don't, you know, and they actually elect somebody else, or they don't do what he wants, basically, that economy is going to continue to deteriorate because they will not be able to borrow, they will not be able to restructure their debt, and the depression and the hyperinflation will continue. So there's a lot of weight on the scale from both sides here. And that's why I think if you really want to be honest about this, you have to look at the candidates and say, okay, if the two sides agree and the election is procedurally fair, that's what we should care about. We're not going to get a fair election that's going to satisfy everyone. And we're not going to get a stolen election like Honduras or like Mexico, okay? It's still cleaner than a lot of the hemisphere.
I know where you're going. America wants clean and free and fair elections in Central and Latin America, really. Yeah, I get what you're saying. Let's move on slightly. What about the rest of the region, Eric? I want to just play this from Juan Manuel Santos from Colombia, because obviously a lot of refugees in that country. There's a long history between those two nations as well. Let's hear him, and I'll ask you about the situation originally off the back.
Like Peru, we're going to continue insisting until we once again see a democracy in Venezuela, working for the well-being of its own people. And we're making a new call, on the government of Venezuela to at least permit a humanitarian corridor.
Eric, that was Juan Manuel Santos from Colombia. What is the region doing, and what more could it do?
Well, tens of thousands of Venezuelans have gone across the border into Brazil and Colombia, as we've heard, and also into the Caribbean. And there are many diaspora in the United States and Canada and elsewhere throughout Latin America as well, Chile, etc. So there is a mass migration of Venezuelans out of the country. And what is the region doing about it? Well, the first issue is that the region is understanding how desperate situation is on the ground in Venezuela. They're calling for international assistance to help assist economist folks who are leaving Venezuela. But the whole issue about a humanitarian assistance or program of assistance for Venezuela is that the government itself refuses to allow that to occur, because by doing so, then they admit that there's a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, and for political reasons, they're unwilling to do that. So the Venezuelan government is preventing humanitarian assistance coming into Venezuela to address the problem that the Venezuelan government has created. This is something that I think people have to recognize, and there is no answer to that other than the Venezuelan government has to allow a change in circumstance for its own people who are otherwise migrating to other countries around the region.
Can I give a 60-second answer?
No, sorry, Mark. I just need to speak to Dany, because you have spoken a lot. And Dany, let's take the economy. What can the Venezuelan government do to turn things around at the moment? There have been various ideas. Obviously, the low oil price is a problem, although other countries are making money at oil at these prices. There's been so many ideas thrown out there, even a cryptocurrency based on oil reserves. How does the Maduro government turn things around, in your opinion, or can they?
Well, you know, to be honest, the only way they can do it is to restore the constitutional order and to resign and to call for free and fair elections, because at this point they have shown they have no ability or willingness to fix it. I mean, the disaster in Venezuela is so large that it's really going to need to go to the IMF and get a bailout and restructure the debt. But who's going to restructure the debt with a government that doesn't even acknowledge that there's a crisis? I just want to say also in regards to the sanctions, I mean, the sanctions were put in place last year, but the crisis started much before. I mean, Venezuela government sanctioned itself. Venezuela, nobody wants to give money to Venezuela. It's a very risky borrower, sorry. It defaulted. So sanctions or not, this is not really going to change the situation on the ground. So there's really, at this point, I mean, I wish that the government will recognize the crisis, they will restore constitutional order, they will respect the National Assembly, and they could restructure the debt. But it's a little bit naive to think that they will do it, because they haven't shown any signs. So my recommendation for them is to resign and to call for free and fair elections.
Eduardo, what's your take on the economic situation also, and where we go politically? Because, you know, let's say these elections go ahead. What's your prediction of where Venezuela will be afterwards?
Well, I should note at the outset that I'm originally from Bolivia, and I wrote my first book when Bolivia was experiencing 26,000% hyperinflation between 1984 and 1985. Venezuela is not quite there yet, and so it has a long way to go. So things can deteriorate even much beyond where they are right now, and especially, as Dany was saying, if there is no real action on the part of the government. I think hyperinflation, if there's something that I learned under hyperinflation in Bolivia, it's the worst and most regressive tax that exists. It's awfully worse than any kind of stabilization measure. And frankly, I don't think that that anybody in Venezuela right now would allow or would even think about the experience that Venezuela has had with any attempt at stabilization in the past. In fact, we may be where Venezuela attempted stabilization in 1989 under Carlos Andrés Pérez. So I don't expect the government to take any major action on the economy. But I'll say something that
I'm sorry to cut you off. We've got 30 seconds left, and I have to give it to Mark, because otherwise he'll complain and feel he was ganged up on. 30 seconds, though.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to answer one thing, because this argument that these people, these right-wing governments, like Colombia, where people are getting killed and human rights workers get killed every day, and, care about the humanitarian part, it's kind of ridiculous, because none of them, including the United States, have made any attempt. First of all, the Trump administration is worsening the shortages of food and medicine with their sanctions, and nobody's made any attempt to get humanitarian aid there. They could go through Bolivia, for example. Bolivian government would be glad to help them. There's been no attempt to do that, so it's all PR.
A really vigorous discussion. I know it's going to continue into April and May and after the elections as well. Please come back, and it's great you were civil to each other despite very, very different views, so I appreciate it. That's it, though, for this edition of The Heat.